So, Andrea, thanks for joining us and spending some time in talking about the role of the bank in the carbon markets in the early years between 1997 and 2005. In order to understand the context, perhaps you could start with telling us a little bit about your role in the carbon market in that period.
Well, Chandra, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to remember those days when everything seemed possible. And well, look, I first entered this world of carbon markets and greenhouse gases, working as the chief of staff for Maurice Strong when he came from Rio de Janeiro from the Earth Summit. And we had no idea because we were in an electric company. And he came and asked me one day to go to Chicago and talk to Richard Sandor about climate change and offsets. And I had absolutely no idea what he meant by that. And I still remember going to Chicago and being shown by Richard a pit and said, this is for corn, this is for oranges, and this is going to be for carbon. It was, okay, it was quite a fascinating thing. The next thing that we got involved in was really the moment where, as a group of power utility from around the world, developing countries, there was this enormous conference of 16 chairmen of large companies. You have to remember this is the mid-1990s. Public utilities and utilities were a much more important social element in the economy of countries at that time. A conference was chaired actually by one Angela Merkel at that time, was Minister of Environment of Germany. But in preparation for that, we were given money to go and do AIJ projects. And it was very interesting because we started looking around the world, our colleagues that were in the power companies that we knew around the world, to look for projects that did offsets. But one thing that we did, also because of the relations that the chair had, we came to the World Bank. And this is when we had discussion with Ivan Telberg and Ken Yukon, whom I met the first time at that time, and explained to him that we had some money, for us substantial amount of money, and we wanted to be able to produce some offsets on the AIJ scheme for the meeting of the chairs. And Ken's reaction was, of course, we have some projects in South Asia. The problem was that our time frame was 6 months, and the time frame that he had in mind was a little bit longer than that. But that was the first connection. After that, frankly, I've done climate change and carbon market from, this was kind of the introduction to the world of carbon markets. But I've done this from different roles. In the UNDP, I led the climate change program. And so this is where I ran it the first time, the Brazilians, and kind of trying to help them establish their capacity. I established AIDA in 1999. This is when I left UN and started AIDA, which we started as a small band of about 30 companies. And I left in 2008 with about 180 companies, with a very large organization. And you could see the enthusiasm. And I remember one board member saying, I don't know what the price of carbon is going to be in the future, but the reason why we're here is because it's not going to be zero. Mm-hmm. So that was, that's something that comes to mind from those days. And then, considering that everybody was doing business, during all these years, especially the AIDA years, we initiated a lot of things with the World Bank. You may remember in the days of Ken, and we did Carbon Expo, we did some of the funds we worked together. And then, I went on to do business and run the exchange in Paris and work for a trading company in Geneva, and now I am as part of a think tank. So I've gone through the cycle and I've learned a lot about the carbon market, but certainly I don't know whether I've accompanied the bank or the bank is, what do you want to call it, but certainly been very close in a lot of the activities that we've done to the activities of the bank.
Yeah. So before we get into a little bit more about the work of the bank and its impact, tell us a little bit more about the early years of AITA when you established it. What were you thinking? who were the early movers, because the International Emissions Trading Association has been a key stakeholder in the carbon market, and it continues to play an influential role. So tell us a little bit more about IETA, why you established it, who were the key partners that you had, and what impact did it have in those early years?
In those early years, coming from Rio, UNCTAD played an important role in Rio. Recupero, who was the Secretary General of UNCTAD at that time, was very sympathetic to this idea of emission trading. So there was a little bit of a critical mass around Rio. Frank Joshua was there, kind of playing running the environmental part. So there was an early attempt to establish AIDA at the COP, first Buenos Aires COP. So we had this enormous panel. I remember AIDA, the initial vision of AIDA was very different. Was kind of a partnership between the UN and private sector, and had all kind of roles, including the role of exchange. It was a little bit more complex. And the first meeting was all these heads of agencies, was Gus Spence and I think Sarah Gildeen, a whole bunch, like 6 or 7, or Michael Zamit Kutayar. But it was too early. For whatever reason that we won't go into details, it was too early, and frankly it was taken over at that meeting in Buenos Aires that was not successful. It was taken over by Bjorn Stigson, who was the president of the World Business Council, together with, my memory fails me, but with a fellow from Shell, and with a Brazilian whose name was Paulo Protasio. And together they ended up establishing the legal entity called AIDA, which was very much under the umbrella of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, to the point where the first offices of AIDA were in the WBCSD offices in Geneva. At that point, as the first president, CEO, whatever you want to call that, this is when I came in. To me, this is my image. Maybe it's false, maybe it's not, maybe it's wrong, but it's clearly there was an EMA, but there was an American organization that, because of the U.S. not being that keen, or U.S. companies that were active in EMA and SOX not being that keen to be seen as getting involved in GHGs, really did not occupy that terrain. So, and the desire was for the international organization. Clearly, the Brazilians. Otherwise, there was no reason for that. So, the prime movers, to me, the people, the companies that have established this are very mind responsible, is BP and Shell. Okay. I would, Mr. Charles Nicholson and Aidan Murphy from Shell, I think these were the two organizations that was critical. Of course, there were others. There were about 28 initially. When I first came at the first meeting of AIDA, there were about 28 companies, my recollection is correct. But it was clearly established through the good efforts and the vision of BP and Shell. Okay. That is my recollection.
So now shifting a little bit to the role of the bank, from your recollection, from your anecdotal, evidence, what was it that got the World Bank engaged in the carbon market?
Well, the bank, my recollection is that there was support in the World Bank for climate change. The World Bank had been quite active, leading to the Rio process, and Ismail Sarah Gildeen, others were quite active, and I think the realization came very early on that there were not that many institutions that had the expertise, the convening power, and certainly the power to of ideas that the World Bank had. And it did start not like all such efforts, not in the basement, but certainly started in the small office with Ken and Ivan Tolberg, which my recollection was seconded from the Norwegians to help, but very, very rapidly increased, and the demand also, I think there was also responding to a certain level of demand coming from both companies and countries. because after Kyoto, uh, between Kyoto and Marrakesh, there was a very long hiatus, and countries and companies really were looking for ways to work with a partner that could guarantee environmental integrity, that could guarantee stability, and being able to manage what were at that time in this business significant amounts of money. Maybe not huge amounts of money, but nevertheless, public money. So the bank came into this and established first of all, they played a role in giving the credibility to this whole approach, but also then establishing the prototype carbon fund. I do, as an anecdote, I do remember kind of being at the first meeting of the prototype carbon fund in Interlaken, I think, and after that was my kind of my last meeting, because then I went over to UNDP. But that was, there was a lot of enthusiasm. There was a Canadian government there. There were companies. There were, quite a variety of people that then went on to become actors in their own right in this business. People that will pop up, and by the way, some of them continue to pop up. Have not, like us, have not given up yet on the concept. But yes, it had that and the prototype carbon fund essentially went ahead and established rules that were mimicking what we thought at that time was were going to be the rules of the Marrakesh Accord. I think they played quite a significant role, not necessarily, I mean, this is my impression now, not necessarily in the sense of going out and lobbying negotiators, but all of these people who were in the prototype carbon fund were in their own right either directly governments, and as such were sitting next door to the negotiator, or they maybe negotiated themselves, but as well companies that were significant economic players in their own jurisdictions. And all these people brought the experience of the prototype carbon fund, of the procedures, the modalities, everything that was learned to the negotiator. So my sense is that, without a direct lobbying effort, I think that on my perception, I think the prototype carbon fund played a significant role in shaping the Marrakesh Accords.
So, in terms of effectiveness, as you indicate that it played a good role or an effective role, what are the things that the bank got correct or right in that overall process leading up to the Marrakesh Accord, and subsequently in the early years of establishing the modalities, procedures, rules, methodologies of the CBM?
Well, I think that the verification parts, some of the methodologies, I mean, clearly were developed through the good offices of the PCF. These were things that, because when we first went and did maybe jumping from one to the other, but not really. When we did the first AIJ projects, frankly, we had no idea. We went to utility and said we want to do this, and then we thought about how do we verify all this? I mean, what do we do? Who do we go to? I remember sitting in a hotel room with a bunch of German utilities, and then we figured, well, we'll go and find some NGO. Well, I mean, that was super ad hoc and super artisanal, but that you cannot do this. And I think the World Bank was the PCF and the whole brain trust that came out of the PCF discovered these procedures that now seem to be kind of for granted. It's the first thing you say, what you do MRV, and what you do third-party verification, and what you have a methodology, and you have a project idea note. I mean, these are things that maybe people have forgotten where they come from, but this is where they come from.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of things that it could have done better.
Well, it's very difficult to, it's not that I don't like to throw stones, and I am, knowing me and knowing each other well, that I'm not shy to criticize. But I think the positive influence of the bank was so overwhelming and made possible this thing to a large degree. Maybe it would have happened probably anyway, but nevertheless, the influence was so overwhelmingly positive that to try and find a scratch on the wall of Notre Dame Cathedral is kind of a tough thing to do. So I'm not I can't remember things that I would kind of say, well, listen, guys, you could have done this better. Honestly, it's not that I'm shy. I just can't name something precisely.
Okay. So in describing the setting up of the AITA and the overall interest of the private sector, you have named BP, Shell. The Norwegian government was very clearly one of the early supporters. Who, in addition to these, who were the champions of the carbon market who made it happen? You talked about the E7 and certainly some of the big names. But what, in your mind, looking back, were the key institutions that supported the initiatives?
Well, look, I mean, in my mind, the main institutions that played a role and continue to play an important role in the carbon market are the World Bank and the European institutions. The European institutions were not active at that point, so it really fell very much on the World Bank. I think the UNFCCC had from that point of view, and maybe they didn't have to have it, but the role, I do not recall them playing a very big role, for the simple reason that, frankly, they didn't have the staff, and it was a very, very small staff. There were, when you talk about E7, there were quite a few big companies, and then there were important actors. So you have to think of Electricité de France. We have to talk of the big Japanese, the Tokyo Electric, the Kansai Electric. You have to think of Norsk Hydro, which was in the PCF, the government of Canada. So these were all, I think, institutions and organizations that played an important role. I think there were a number of law firms that were Baker McKenzie comes one law firm that I remember, kind of came very early to play into this. But also there were some of the verifier. SGS comes to mind as being early on. I mean, it's just my recollection. Also in the AIJ projects, and I think that Jose Maria Figueres was then in the president of Costa Rica, I think, in that period. So certainly, while not being a super big player, but gave some credibility to the enterprise. I would think that's in Brazil, there were people in Brazil. Their interest was by and large in the agroforestry business. That was where there was UNICA, which was the association of sugarcane producers, which were players into this. And then I think that an important player was not necessarily that he was a member of AITA. I don't think he was a member in AITA until later on. But Richard Sander did play a role in this. Richard always somebody that has the sense of the momentum and the presence. So he was again, I think, an important player. But again, going back, and at that time, I would say that one personality that comes to mind that I thought was very influential in AITA and in the information, I thought it was Paulo Protasio, the first chair of AITA. And I think the second important person that comes to mind, who was essential, was Charles Nicholson from BP. I think that he was instrumental because of his support and the proximity to Lord Brown. I think these were very, very important people in making this thing happen.
Certainly, I mean, my own recollection in those early years, Richard Sandor and the Chicago Exchange listing the Costa Rican CTOs as the first transaction, and I can certainly appreciate Sir Charles Nicholson's role in AITA because he played a similar anchor role in setting up of the PCF, and he was one of the champions in those early years, promoting the interest of a number of companies and going out there to talk. So certainly.
So Charles was instrumental because he was somebody. Look, the Business Council was not in a position to be an AITA or have AITA as a subset because of the variety of corporates in the Business Council that were not all necessarily favorable. But to be also fair, I think that while not necessarily very visible always to the naked eye, Bjorn Stixon did play a role of advising and being a backstop for the organization. I have to say and I have to confess that many issues were solved by dealing with Bjorn, who could deal with AITA was a level of CEO, vice president in the board, while the business council was a CEO level. So whenever, in many cases, they did help us to recruit people. So Bjorn's role should not be exaggerated, but neither should be minimized.
Okay. So in those early years, as the World Bank continued to play an increasingly important role in determining the process, procedures, and so on, your role as the CEO, president of AITA, did you sense any antagonism towards the World Bank or the role of the World Bank, or was it viewed that the private sector was fully engaged and the World Bank's effort were consistent with what the private sector wanted to do?
I think that everything is temporal, and there's absolutely no doubt that for many years the bank was more than welcome, and maybe not everybody quite understood how welcome. But there was little doubt that there was no opposition. There was a point where the market had started to take off, and there may have been some people who felt that the bank was maybe competition for some deals. I think that, my view was that if this market was big enough, somebody like the World Bank was playing a shifting role, playing a different role. The World Bank, the IFC, you're playing a role of the post-2012 funds that nobody really wanted to do or could do. We were anchored with Mercuria in those. The CDCF that nobody wanted to do but was very close to the... So I think that the bank's role shifted in time. I think that there's always somebody whining in the business community that somebody's getting in their way. You have to remember that there were waves, and the first wave was a bunch of people that were from the environmental community that decided that they had business skills and they wanted to do business, and they could make a lot of money doing good, and these people kind of rode the wave of the bank. And there was a point where, and these people kind of welcomed, and I think they were synergetic. There was a point where some of the traders started coming in. The traders, like lawyers, know everything. And I started saying, well, we don't need this anymore. We can do this. You guys leave us alone. It's fine. The reality is that by 2007-8, they were all saying this, and by 2010, the market has collapsed, and everybody was begging the bank to get back into it. So it is not my perception that there was legitimate concern of any magnitude. There were deals that happened where the bank played a role, important role, that maybe private sector tried to do those deals, kind of asked the bank to get out, and then figure that really then the bank was needed. It's not because you're hugging this. It's just certain things that there are certain governments that will only deal with certain institutions, and the talent, if you want, of somebody, of a coach, is to play with the team and get all the players in the field. And those that were smart and understood that not they could use the bank, but they could work with the bank, I think were the ones that in the end did well.
Yeah. And in terms of the key milestones in that period where the private sector, the large scale, as you said, the private sector banks, the traders started coming in, what led to that development? I definitely recall that a watershed moment was the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol by Russia. But were there other waves, as you called it, which influenced that whole development in the 2006, 2007 to about 2009 period, where the market doubled every year almost, or every quarter?
Well, I think that the fact that the Russian ratification was a difficult process, and we made a few trips to Moscow to deal with that, but made an impression because really allowed this to become totally legit. Until the Kyoto Protocol got into force, there was still, people kind of say lawyers like to have that kind of regulatory certainty. I believe that where the ETS had the linking directive, and this is beginning to become a fairly strict compliance in the second period of the EU emission trading scheme, and where big volumes of especially industrial gases started coming in, and where people really realized that this was going to be a big business. I think that's what, in my mind, made a difference. I think that was a game changer in this business, is when this very large volumes, which were available in a number of sectors and gases, that changed the business.
Okay. So now beginning to look at the future based on the experience with the Kyoto markets, in context essentially over the last 2 decades, certainly 10 years of experience in engaging in this kind of a market created by regulation, with substantial private sector capacity, which essentially was not there, as you described, around the early 2000s, or 1997 to 2005. And the role of the bank was to establish proof of the concept through setting up the prototype carbon fund, defining the procedure. The market is at a similar stage now. The Paris Agreement has Article 6, which still needs to be agreed upon. The equivalent of Marrakesh hasn't happened as far as Article 6 is concerned to the rule book. But the contexts are different. You may be in a similar stage, but in a different context with substantial private sector capacity. And I would like to focus on the role of the bank in that context, based on its strengths and existing experience and strengths of the private sector. How would you describe the role of the private sector, and what should the bank do, and how should they work together, as you say?
Yes, it is, on the face of it, not dissimilar, because the moment it's a regulatory market, and the regulatory moment is not dissimilar, but it is dissimilar. And there are a number of reasons. Yes, a lot of the capacity has been lost, especially the smaller independent capacity, if you want. The service providers really couldn't hold people and do nothing, and many of them have left. And in the corporate also, a lot of people have gone. But we can't forget what we learned. I mean, yes, we lose a lot of institutional memory, but you can't forget everything that you learn. So it is different from that point of view. And sometimes it's a little bit like the army. You only from the army remember the good times. In this case, a lot of people remember the bad times because say, oh my God, this thing got out. So it is a different moment. It is a different moment because also the Paris Agreement is different. It's a very, very different animal. And the role of the bank, which had been acting as an aggregator, as a purchaser, if you want, now is seeing each client countries playing a very, very different role. The client countries have NDCs. There's a South-South cooperation and potential flows. The economic and emissions pattern around the world is dramatically changed from 1997, 2000. So a lot of, yes it is, but it is also dramatically changed. So my view is that, yes, and the other thing is, Chandra, is that yes, there is some institutional memory and things being learned, and you can still call some people back and so on. But what in developing country needs to be done is very different from what was done before. Basically, there was a bunch of people that were being chased down by a bunch of brokers trying to buy stuff from them, and some of them more if you want, better reputation than others. but that was initially was relatively passive. Now what you have is you have a much better educated developing country team crew, but that will need to develop a lot of things that they have no clue. They haven't gone through that experience. They need to develop their own legal framework, their own MRV framework, their own registries. I mean, these are things that, you know, they're not necessarily true that you can do it right away. The EU, which is a, you know, relatively rich and sophisticated jurisdiction, has had its own pains to do something like that. If the EU has had pains, you can imagine what other countries' problems may have. So the role of the bank is going to be different. The role of the bank, I think, is going to be in terms of getting into these countries and help develop a regulatory system and capacity. That's no doubt about it. The role of the bank is going to be, at this point, I think in my mind, is to maybe provide an aggregation, but I can see the aggregation actually on the other side, where there's an aggregation on the side of the seller, and one of the reasons for that is that there's going to be very strong branding under the Paris Agreement. Under the Kyoto Protocol, countries didn't have much to say, so the possibility of branding at national level was relatively limited. In this case, there's going to be strong branding as to, because the ITMOs, these international mitigation outcomes, are going to be produced nationally according to national rules. So how they come out, and, you know, how much scarcity you have in the system, and how strong your rule of law is, all these things are going to come to play in a very serious way. So that's where I think the bank is going to play a role in changing the role to an aggregator, in changing the role in establishing this whole infrastructure and regulatory system, but also in starting this thing early. And in this interim period, you know, we look at Article 6. Article 6 was the last thing was agreed in Paris, and the last thing that was not agreed in Katowice. And as such, you look at what needs to be agreed, there's still divergence. I mean, we had an Article 6 panel here, that divergence still comes in quite strongly. Some people don't see it, prefer to say that they are on the 1 yard line, but they're not, I don't think they're on 1 yard line. And creating this, you know, kind of this regulatory, quasi-regulatory system or infrastructure that allows to mimic the functions that seem to be emerging from the Article 6 is going to be an important element. My view is that companies are business is going to be looking at the bank to play the same role that it played in the PCF, in establishing the role of, if you want, the role of documentation, because the risks are very different in here. The risk will be different from what we had in the CDM. They will have to look at the role of creating the, if you want, the making sure that countries are going to want to engage, because we are again not in the Kyoto Protocol. In the Kyoto Protocol, you know, somebody said, if you have more money, I have more paper. In this case, you're going to have a senior Indian, Indonesian, or Bolivian bureaucrat signing on the export license for an ITMO. Now, you know, if I can hardly see at this stage of the game, and maybe for a couple of years, the typical broker out of New York or Geneva kind of flying out to Jakarta and getting this thing signed, I think that it's going to be a very, very different animal if the World Bank says, listen, we are here to aggregate and make sure that you get a deal that's commensurate with this being a national reserve. So these are very different roles. I think there will be probably a role when this is all going to be ossified and solidified, where probably the role of the bank is going to be again different, and probably also again move into the kind of project that were, you know, the love of my life, the CDETF, which is a sentimental piece of work.
Yeah, so I fully agree with you. I do think the role is going to be slightly different this time. I think it's much more work on the individual countries to make them understand. In the case of the CDM, there was an interaction with the host country, but the risks were very small for them, right? All they had to sign off was that the project contributed to sustainable development and that there were no other commitments beyond that. Whereas, as you pointed out, this time it is going to be about the project and its relationship to NDC and the commitments made at the international level. The bureaucrat, as you said, signing off on this is taking a risk in some ways that the project undermines the NDC, takes away low-hanging fruit, all of the concerns which were initially there in the case of the Kyoto Protocol, where we all worked together to alleviate that risk by indicating that that was not really the case.
There is this other aspect, Chandra, is that in my view, because of this branding, I think branding is one thing, but branding doesn't have to take a bad connotation and doesn't have to take the connotation of a race to the bottom. Mm-hmm. Branding can take the connotation of red to the top, and I think that that's what one of the roles the bank can do. The other they can have, and the other, and the flip side of that is that the role of the bank, together with your other colleagues in the regions, may be to ensure that parties, that client states, I don't know what the exact language is, do not compete on quality. Mm-hmm. Because that is something that will destroy this whole enterprise. If people kind of start saying, well, I'm going to cut some corners here because I can sell something cheaper, then that's going to destroy the credibility mm-hmm. of the market. And I think that ensuring that kind of attitude does not emerge and people understand there's not a winner for anybody, it's probably something that only an institution like the bank can do.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the roles are different. It's much more complicated, much more intensive in terms of engagement. It's you can't do it through the CF Assist host country meetings. It has to be done country by country. So
if I yes. may, Chandra, one apologies for one more thing, which is an important thing, and I shouldn't forget this. There is this, you invented, you created all these concepts of third party, etc. You borrowed it from somewhere else, but you introduced it here. In this case, you have already started through some of your initiatives like NCM to create new ideas. Some of them may be some way far away in another galaxy, way too early, or maybe it will never happen. But it's a place where you can think about these things, mm-hmm. and that is absolutely necessary because we are moving in a different world, and these things, according to the International Accounting Standard Board, really behave like currencies, do not behave like commodities. And this is something that needs to be thought through from an intellectual point of view, what it means. Things like blockchain, again, something that everybody says, oh my God, blockchain, this is Bitcoin. But blockchain is a very different thing. And in this decentralized world, again, who can test an idea like this? Well, I cannot sit in the basement of my house and invent this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that is one of the amazing things about the World Bank. It does provide you with resources, time, people, very bright people, to try out things which are very difficult in any other environment, and we have supporters and partners and champions in the form of many of our shareholders on the donor side, and also shareholders on our client side, who are willing to fund on one end and willing to try on the other end a range of things which they would not under normal circumstances, certainly not experiment with their own money with the private sector risk. So it is an opportunity and an institution which allows for this kind of a innovation. So Andrei, to conclude, I think what would your advice be to the managers in the bank on how to be more effective in catalyzing the next generation of the markets?
I think that the bank's role, and my advice would be to continue to produce this intellectual ferment, which is, in my mind, really super important. I can't think of anybody else that can do this for the reasons that we discussed so far. The second piece is that we are in a period where chance had it that we did not reach an agreement in Katowice, and as such, the role of the bank in the development of the market is actually more important. If all the rules had been set and everybody would be happy, then yeah, I mean, you can be an aggregator and do whatever. But in this case, the rules, there's still options, you know, more complicated or more less complicated or fewer or more of them, but there are options. And I think to come up with the test to make this happen with the confidence that, you know, you cannot offer guarantees for this, but you can offer the confidence that everything has been done that is possibly to be done. I think that's an important role. And developing the instruments for risk management, some of them don't have necessarily, are not even going to be present in the, I mean, even if you mimic the Paris Agreement Article 6 rule book, they're not going to be there. This is, you know, you think that that's the rule, and, you know, the rule exactly like this or slightly different, the instruments for risk management, that you may apply at the beginning and offer yourself. But in time, they will be picked up by others that will offer them on a competitive basis. But right now, you know, I can tell you that probably there's not that many people. You know, I remember the CDM insurance products that were offered to us at the very end of the CDM cycle. There was this guy from Parhelion, I think, that was coming around to offer us insurance. Man, I said, well, this is kind of late at this point. You know, it's very interesting, but the market is kind of peering out. We needed that stuff at the beginning of the market. So, you know, there are risks that are clearly, again, not related that how you do your adjustment, or you do it here or there, but you will do some adjustment, and there's got to be ways to make sure you mitigate that risk. These are things that, and then, you know, this third leg of starting to work with countries to bring them to the market. I think that's a process that's going to take long. You know, again, developing countries are not necessarily used to think that way, so this will take a few years. And a few years to 2019, a few years is 2021. People will want to have product at the market in those days.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andrei. This was fantastic. Thank you for taking the time.
It was a pleasure, and thank you for inviting each other. It's always a pleasure to remember the old times.